Good afternoon. Before we get started here, we're close to capacity. I would ask people if there's seats that are open next to them, please move towards the center. We're not, by fire code, allowed to have people stand in the aisle or bring in any extra chairs. I think there's one or two seats in the front here. I just ask you don't take my seat right there. Thank you. So for those of you who weren't here yesterday, my name is Michael Crespin. I'm the director and curator of the Carl Albert Congressional Research and Studies Center. Welcome to the second lecture of the 2019 Julian J. Rothbaum Distinguished Lectureship on Representative Government. On behalf of the center, the Rothbaum family, I want to thank you for your attendance at this biennial event. And this is a fantastic crowd. Like I said, I think we're at capacity, and I'm happy to see that. We sponsor this lectureship to bring together scholars, students, and citizens to nurture the values of a representative democracy. Through our mission and in our center programs, we strive to strengthen representative democracy through engaged and informed citizens. And what we do at these lectures is we inform our citizens. And I think we've done a great job yesterday, and we're going to continue today, and we have another lecture tomorrow. So before introducing our lecturer, it's my pleasure to introduce the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, David Rebell. Dean Rebell is the David L. Boren Professor and Merrick Chair of Western American History. Dean Rebell's research and teaching focus on the history of the American West, so I'm sure he's especially interested in our lectures today. Dean Rebell.
Good afternoon, everybody. Well, it's a particular pleasure to be involved in the introductions for this afternoon's talk. The Carl Albert Center for Congressional Research, the core sponsor of today's event, was, up until just a few months ago, a Provost Direct unit, and now I'm very proud to let you all know that it is a unit within the College of Arts and Sciences, so absolutely thrilled about that and the partnerships that will come from that. And the Carl Albert Center does wonderful, wonderful work for this university. And its sponsorship of this event is one of the most memorable things. The Rothbaum Lecture is named in honor of Mr. Julian J. Rothbaum of Tulsa, Oklahoma, a leader in Oklahoma civic affairs and an important supporter of our university, also a lifelong friend of Speaker Carl Albert. Mr. Rothbaum attended the University of Oklahoma from 1932 to 36, was president of the student body. So all the students in the room, you could be president of the student body and then donate large sums of money to the university later in life. So he served a 4-year tour in the Army during World War II, and then in 1946 moved to Tulsa to serve as the first director of the newly created Tulsa District of the Federal Housing Administration, was the youngest FHA director in the United States. In the early 1950s, he owned and operated the Rothbaum Mortgage Banking Company, served as president of the Oklahoma Mortgage Bankers Association, and later became associated with Francis Oil and Gas of Tulsa, eventually serving as chairman of their board until his death on September 26, 2003. Mr. Rothbaum actively supported education in the state of Oklahoma throughout his life. He established student awards in honor of Carl Albert at the University of Oklahoma, at McAllister High School in Oklahoma, as well as the Carl Albert Prize at St. Peter's College at Oxford University. In addition, Mr. Rothbaum sponsored awards in music and in petroleum land management for outstanding students at the university, and with his wife Irene, endowed a presidential professorship of excellence in the College of Fine Arts. After his wife's death in 1996, Mr. Rothbaum honored her by endowing the Irene Rothbaum Award for the Outstanding Assistant Professor in the College of Arts and Sciences. In 1998, he established at the OU College of Law an annual award in honor of his son, Joel Jankowski, to recognize the graduating student who exemplifies the highest standard of excellence in leadership, scholarship, and selfless service to others. In 2003, Mr. Rothbaum established the Irene and Julian Rothbaum Professor of History Endowed Chair, held by my friend and colleague sitting right in the back, David Chappelle, an internationally renowned scholar of civil rights. Give us a wave, David. All right. And a bow. Mr. Rothbaum served 2 terms on the Board of Regents of the University of Oklahoma, was also a member of the State Regents for Higher Education, was inducted into the Oklahoma Hall of Fame in 1986, was the special advisor to higher education to Governor David Walters in the early 1990s. In honor of this record of service, the University of Oklahoma awarded him the Distinguished Service Citation in 1974 and an honorary doctorate in 1993. Julian Rothbaum passed away less than a week shy of his 90th birthday in 2003, and the annual Rothbaum Lecture is one of the ways that we honor his remarkable legacy and celebrate the transformative effect that his support has had on our students and our faculty. So thank you to the Rothbaums for their wonderful legacy. Thanks to the Carl Albert Center for its support of this event. And let me welcome back to the stage Mike Crespin to introduce our speaker for the day.
Thank you, Dean Rebell. It's my pleasure now to introduce our lecturer, Professor Bruce Cain. Professor Cain is the Charles Louis de Comen Professor in Humanities and Sciences and the Spence and Cleone Eccles Family Director of the Bill Lane Center for the American West at Stanford University. He's also a senior fellow at the Stanford Woods Institute for the Environment, the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research, and the Precourt Institute for Energy. He received his BA from Bowdoin College, was a Rhodes Scholar, as Dean Rebell pointed out, so was Speaker Albert, and earned his PhD from Harvard University. Professor Cain was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2000 and has won awards for his research, teaching, and public service. In yesterday's lecture, Professor Cain told us about the importance of thinking about the West as a region rather than as individual states. We also learned about the potential for future fights over water and the need to recognize the vast amounts of Western land that are under federal control. Please help me welcome Professor Cain for a second lecture, The Potential Opportunities of Climate Catastrophe.
Well, thank you very much. I see that we have a lot of students here, and that reminds me that we probably have a captive audience. You might say, well, Bruce, I mean, what joy do you get out of a captive audience? I get it all the time. I teach students all the time. But my goal, I know that some of you are here for class requirements, is to make you happy captives, or at least better informed ones. I have a lot of territory to cover today, but I thought it would be useful because there are people here that weren't here yesterday, and so I want to just elaborate a couple themes because they're relevant to what I want to talk about today. First of all, when I say the American West, as I said yesterday, I'm talking about the 100th meridian, although I pointed out the 100th meridian is moving, the line of aridity is moving to the east. But we define it as the 100th meridian because we think a distinctive feature of the American West is the lack of precipitation and the evapotranspiration that comes with the temperature. So we said that the distinctiveness of the characteristics of the West also then shape the challenges of climate change. And so there's a reason to talk about climate change as it affects the region because there are particular ways in which climate change will affect our region that you don't see elsewhere. And the best example of that is something I'm going to spend a fair amount of time on, which is wildfires. Yes, there are wildfires in other parts of the country, but really wildfires are concentrated to the west of the 100th meridian, and they are much more severe, and particularly as you get into areas like California, Oregon, and Washington. So, but I do want to add a footnote to what I said yesterday based on feedback that I got from various people who said, given that we've got all these problems, how much of it is about climate change and how much is it about people and where they reside? So I want to just say a little bit about that because this is going to underlie my discussion of a lot of policies that I'm going to go through today. So last time I pointed out that the West was really explored early by people like John Wesley Powell and Lewis and Clark. And in a broad, obviously oversimplified caricature of the West, you could say that the early residents of the West or the early explorers of the West were one category of people, and that The second category of people were the settlers, the people that actually came to live and work on that land. And the settlers have very different expectations than the explorers. They needed to have the infrastructure, they needed to be able to establish towns, and most importantly, they needed to have water to sustain their existence in semi-arid and arid areas. And so the federal government played a very prominent role in developing the conditions that made a previously inhospitable area hospitable. And it did it in various ways. It did it in terms of irrigation and constructing dams. It did it in creating infrastructure like the railroads in 1869, connecting the railroads. It did it in terms of the highway system under the pressures of World War I and World War II and the need to defend the Pacific Front. It did it in providing federal security forces, which we now realize were, shall we say, a little overzealous in the way they conducted their exercises against Native Americans, but they were part of securing the West for the settlers. So my point is that unlike the adventurers and the explorers, you needed to make what was inhospitable hospitable. And in the 19th century, you had the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, and you had a scientific revolution that made us believe that we could engineer conditions and the environment to be the way we want it to be rather than the way we found it. And so there was an enormous enthusiasm and an enormous, shall we say, optimism about science as creating a more hospitable environment. And that optimism persists today as we talk about climate change. And it persists in what I will talk about, which is one strategy that is by far the most popular strategy in the West, even if other strategies, I would argue, are potentially more important and more effective. This is the one that people want, and that's accommodation. That is, they want to build structures to be resilient to fires, to be resilient to floods, and to be able to have adequate water resources in the face of floods. They want to accommodate themselves and protect themselves within the context of the environment. What they don't want to do is move populations or restrict growth in the West. And so that very expansionism, which was critical to the federal government. The federal government wanted to settle these territories, A, to make sure that other countries didn't take it, and B, to basically encourage economic activity and farming in other areas of the country. That expansionism, which was called the frontier hypothesis, still has a kind of residual momentum to it. That is to say, we can't go beyond the frontier. The frontier we got to the Pacific Ocean, the frontier closed, but the expansion was the infill expansion, which is still going on in the West. Now, the interesting thing about the West expansion, by the way, is that we think of the spaciousness, we think of the national parks, we think of the wilderness areas, we think of the beauty, but the reality is that many parts of the West are the most urbanized areas in the country. Many parts of the West are the most urbanized areas of the country because you have heavy concentrations of populations in Los Angeles, in Denver, Salt Lake City. And so, ironically, we have, if you were to look at a map of the lights at night, you would see splotches of density in the West and then splotches of darkness. And then on the East, you would see a continuous array of lights. And that tells you all you need to know about the very unusual spacing of the West, which creates challenges in terms of healthcare and transportation, but we're not going to go there today. I simply want to get back to this one big theme, which social scientists call the moral hazard theme, because it's going to underlie a lot of things that I'm going to talk about today. So a moral hazard is, in social science lingo, when you make things safer, you encourage riskier behavior. Okay? So probably, giving people helmets has helped to proliferate some of the extreme sports. Providing insurance provides a security in terms of losing your home that encourages people to live in floodplains, to live on the shore that might be swamped by sea level rise. And clearly, if we provide levels of protection, we elevate homes, we provide different kinds of materials for homes that are in wildland areas, what we're doing is potentially creating a moral hazard. But again, this conflicts with our notion that we really want to populate the West, that there's so much beauty here that we want to share, and that we believe that there's a freedom of choice, that people ought to be able to reside where they want to reside, but we have this fundamental contradiction that we're going to have to pay the price. And so I'm going to talk about two ways that moral hazard plays out. One is with respect to individual risk. That is, we encourage individual owners to live in given areas by providing them with insurance or providing them with subsidies potentially to take protective measures. But then there's a larger social risk, which several people asked me about in the last lecture, which is if we're encouraging continuous population growth in an area of the region in which water is a scarce commodity and possibly a scarcer commodity because of rising temperatures, then unlike electricity, which we can generate new sources of, you can't generate new water very easily. You have to really recycle it or clean it up, which is extremely expensive. So the real question is, what is the social limitation of growth in an area which is potentially less hospitable as a result of climate change, okay? So I just wanted to, that was a follow-up for those of people who were here last time and may have had some questions about where I think the population aspect of it comes. Okay, so obviously another reason why students might come is that it has the word catastrophe in it. And this is a generation that likes disruption, right? And sure, you're getting it right now. So in the last couple years, there has been a proliferation of extremely expensive weather events, which I will call extreme weather. This is the year 2017, and you can see that there were wildfires that were $1 billion. There were droughts that had, crop damage and other expenses. You had hailstorms, you had tornadoes, you had, of course, the hurricanes, all of which, in terms of putting out the fires or relieving people that were stuck and rebuilding and all of that, have huge price tags attached to them, okay? And in 2018, we had a second year just like that. Now, an interesting thing about it is not only are they expensive, but they are distributed across a lot of different events across the United States. And that, to me, presents the possibility that extreme weather will allow us to have a more rational discussion about climate change. And it turned out at lunch today we had a presentation, a spontaneous presentation by one of the professors here, Joe Ripberger. And he basically has been covering Oklahoma public opinion for the last 5 years with a panel. And what Joe's data shows is that you might think that everybody's views about climate change are extremely stable, but what Joe shows is that a fair number of Republicans have extremely variable views. They're not the uneducated, not paying attention Republicans, they're ones that are paying attention, and that they can correlate the variance in this with the weather events in specific spots. Now, I haven't read this paper, but if it strikes me as a fairly important paper, and it's very close to the point that I want to make, which is to ask the question, to what extent does extreme weather create the conditions of a greater collaboration across the West, a regional collaboration on climate change? And if you look, there is a kind of rise in the number of these billion-dollar events. The ones that are sharply in color are the years that are listed on the right, and you can see that some of the most expensive events are in recent years. So whether you believe climate change is largely a function of human activity or whether it's largely a function of natural cycles, it doesn't matter from the point of view of resilience. You have to be resilient to how the environment is changing. And that opens up the possibility of a more bipartisan discussion about climate change. So let me start with what mobilizes political action generally on environmental matters. So one framework which has been lying around for 40 years in political science, hydrologists tell me that it's been used by hydrology earlier than that. And you may have noticed that Rahm Emanuel used this during the Obama administration to talk about how the fiscal crisis created situations in which you could create novel policies that would create the conditions. But let me give you the more political science version of this. which comes from a man named John Kington, who recently retired up in California, so I've actually brought him to class. So basically the idea is that a policy window is an opportunity created by a confluence of three different things: the right problems, the right policies, and the right politics. And that window opens up, but it's a finite time. It doesn't open up continuously. It opens up for a short period of time because public attention is limited. And so you get somewhere between 6 months and a year and a half to actually do something. And so the idea of policy windows is you better be prepared for that window, because that window is very going to close. And while you would like in an ideal world for people to be conscious of all the problems of climate change and extreme weather, and to take the steps that they need without the prompting of extreme weather, the reality is that democracy needs a kick in the tush to do something. And that kick comes from catastrophe. So there's actually books in history and political science called Crisis and Compromise, that a lot of democratic systems need crisis to spur itself to move forward. Now, the idea is there are three streams. One is there is a problem stream, that is, there's something that needs to be solved. The second one is a policy stream. There are policies that we have that could solve that problem. That's not always the case, right? And then the third thing is that the politics come together for that there's enough of consensus in the system to overcome the barriers and inertia in the political system. That opens up a policy window, which is usually finite. That's the system. That's what they say. So let's take a look at some previous crises and then compare it to the climate change adaptation and mitigation. So one of them, back in the 1970s, was the hole in the ozone layer. And you can see from the little picture, the idea was that the sun would come down and be screened by the atmosphere, but that the emissions of CFCs, these are carbofluorocarbons, which were often in hairsprays and other devices, were eroding that protection and creating a hole in the atmosphere, allowing the ultraviolet light to come through. And the idea was that that was a potential for cancer, and there were reports of scientists being afraid to work in Antarctica and places where they might be exposed to these rays. So there was a fair amount of panic at the time, okay? But now the ozone hole has pretty much closed. And in fact, there was an article in the paper just recently that officially it's almost completely closed. So how did we succeed with this particular climate event? So let's break it down in terms of the three policy streams. Well, first of all, it was a potentially serious health hazard, right? It potentially could cause cancer to be exposed to the UV light. Secondly, there was a straightforward connection between the science and what might happen to you, okay? And nobody was disputing the connection between being exposed to UV light and health. Maybe some people were, but for the most part, it was not divided. Thirdly, there were limited economic interests at stake. Basically, there was DuPont and a few companies that were making the CFCs and putting them into these aerosol cans. But it was pretty easy to substitute out other kinds of chemicals, or to make what is more frequent now, the sort of pumps that don't use that CFC. So it was pretty simple to make a substitution, a technical substitution. And lastly, in 1974 or 1976, you were still in this kind of honeymoon after World War II of bipartisanship, where Democrats and Republicans were not as highly polarized as they are in the contemporary period, okay? So now let's go to the second one. The second was a little bit more extensive, harder to negotiate, and that was acid rain. So what was acid rain? Acid rain was that coal burning, energy plants, and other industrial units were emitting smoke which had particulate matter in it, had NOx and SOx in it. It would go up into the atmosphere, it would be absorbed into the cloud droplets, and it would land back down on the soil. And once again, we were able to make progress on that. It took a little longer, but we were able to make progress on that. And so a lot of the forests and the structures that were being essentially eroded by the acidity of the rain are no longer being eroded. So we have another success story. So let's walk through it once again. Yes, again, potentially serious consequences for life, property, quality of life, etc. There was a straightforward cause and effect, and so people accepted the science of it and could accept the policy implications, which was to control the emissions coming out of the smokestacks. But politically, it was a little harder because you were taking on the energy industry, which was much broader than a single company producing CFCs or a few companies. So it was more difficult and imposed more cost on a powerful industry. And thirdly, it was the beginning, especially when you get to the early 80s, of the polarization period that now everybody takes for given, as granted. So you had a changing political context. So now we are at the present. And I'm sure the students have had this in high school, and the rest of you are also up on this, so I won't spend a lot of time, but obviously the emission of greenhouse gases causes the trapping of heat, raises the temperature. This warms the seas. It creates storms that are more powerful, that drop more moisture, that cause more flooding. It causes extended droughts and more variation in political. And in the West, we already have a lot of variation in our climate politics, our climate situation. So let's go through the checklist. And you see now the checklist is even more complicated than it was for acid rain. First of all, the effects have manifested themselves over time. In other words, it took accumulation of a critical mass of the CO2 and the methane and the greenhouse gases to get up there to really come up with a statistically measurable effect. So it took time for scientists to measure how much CO2 was accumulating up there. It's now an established fact. We know it's there, okay? But then there's a second part of the causation sequence, which is the relationship between that and extreme weather events. And that turns out to be a much more difficult statistical problem that required a lot more science on using probabilities. And that is not something that people in the general public understand very well. So the science was more complicated. The effects were delayed. They weren't immediate. They took a while to build up. And the extent of the economic interest that we're talking about is just vastly greater than it was for those two other events. Because you think about what we're talking about, what we need to do in order to mitigate, we're not just talking about the electricity grid, we're talking about transportation. We're talking about basically a lot of aspects of how the food we eat, of the way we do agriculture, the way we do manufacturing. It basically affects an enormous part of the economy. And so you would expect that more interest groups would be concerned about the cost, concerned about possible limitations on their economic activities. And then, in addition, exogenously, there are a lot of other reasons why the political system has become more polarized, having to do with racial polarization, having to do with economic inequality, having to do with social sorting, party sorting. I could go on. We won't go in there, but just understand that polarization measurably increased. Political science, if you take the political science classes, you can see the Congress used to have a big overlap in the middle, and now the number of people, the most liberal Republican doesn't come anywhere close to the most conservative Democrat. So you basically have a separation as a result of the homogenization of the coalitions in the Democratic and Republican Party. So that is an additional contextual factor that makes the politics all that much harder. And so this is an example of the statistical problem where you're trying to figure out what the underlying trend is, and you have all these variations. And so it doesn't surprise me that that kind of uncertainty creates the kind of skepticism about the science that we didn't see in the early incidents. So this is from a regional poll that we did, and we have left behind, for any students that are interested in this, with Michael, a Oklahoma oversample where a lot of these questions were asked of about 600 residents of Oklahoma. So if any students want to do projects on that or papers on that, you should see Michael. So one thing we asked is, what's the perception of the scientific community? And I think for a lot of us, one real concern is that there are people that are doubting the chemistry and the ecology that is established by the scientific community. That is a place that we've never been to before, Yes, there are times when science has been wrong. Yes, there are forms of science, either industry-related science or dietary science, that are not really held to the same standards, but we've never really had the serious challenging of academic science the way we are seeing in the contemporary period. So in these, you see, most scientists think global climate change is happening, or there's a lot of scientific disagreement. So the green is, we think this is happening, we buy the consensus, and the yellow is not, and the don't know are the other colors, or you know, some mixture. And you can see the big divide between the Democrats and Republicans on whether to believe the science. And so the perception there is the science is being in the universities being liberal havens, which, let's be honest, often they are, that those values have seeped into the scientific evaluations. So with that background, we can see that potentially the perception of the problem is what drives opening up the window. So the real question here is, how does this really work, okay? In other words, if people see a problem, do they necessarily act, or is the political system more complicated than this model suggests? For one thing, we already know, because we've talked about it in the first lecture, not that everybody was here, but I'll tell you anyway, the politics box affects the problem box. That is, there's a lot of evidence that the people who are Democrats and Republicans see the problems of climate change very differently based on their party membership, okay? And of course, the politics box also affects the policies box. But it also goes the other way around. That is to say, it's entirely possible that the problems of extreme weather could affect the policy and the politics box. And so while it sort of seems like everything goes down to the policy window, there's actually interactions between these different effects. So how much do you think climate change events will personally harm you? Here, the green and the yellow are, well, I don't think it hurts me very much or not at all. And you can see that across all the different regions, the subregions, the western coast states are Oregon, Washington, and California. The plain states are basically from Oklahoma up to North Dakota. The border states are Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico. And the interior are all the other states, the Idahos, the Wyomings, the Montanas. And you don't see an enormous variation across the different regions. A little bit more skepticism in the plain states and in the interior. But most of that is accounted for by party. So if you look across again, the green and the yellow are the people that doubt that extreme weather is going to hurt you. And you can see that it's basically less than 20% of the Democrats across the region. And you can see that it's close to over 60% of Republicans. So the party divide trumps, so to speak, the sub-regional divide that you have in the American West. So let me give you a puzzle, though. According to that theory, if there's a problem and people agree that there's a problem, then they should be willing, and if there are solutions, they should be willing to take action. So let's look at the problem of sea level rise in California. So in California, no surprise to anybody in this audience, there are very aggressive policies to address climate change. And it's been challenged a couple times in the polls, and in each time the challenge to the policies that we have been defeated. In other words, voters have had multiple chances to say, no, we don't want to be so aggressive on mitigation, but they have stuck to mitigation, and they support California's climate leadership. And this is from a study we did where we broke people into how actively environmentally engaged are you. The group 1 is the least engaged, group 2 and group 3 are the more engaged, and what you see is that the more engaged people are in environmental matters, the more they're convinced that climate change is important. And that's important because not all citizens actively participate, but this is screening for how actively do you participate in the political system. So my point is, California is totally on board. There's no partisan division. You cannot blame inaction on partisan division in California. Nope. Okay? So we've taken away partisanship. So it ought to be the case, since they believe sea level rise is real and climate change is real, it ought to be the case that California moves forward and does something about sea level rise. So here we have the Bay Area, And those areas that are in blue are areas that are threatened by sea level rise, projected by science to happen in the next 20 years. Okay? And it's already started. So San Francisco Bay waters have risen by 8 inches since the 1800s, 6 inches since 1950. This is the point that scientists keep making, that there's an acceleration that makes this different from what we've seen historically. And the projections are that it'll rise by 2 feet in 2050 and 5 feet by 2100. And this, of course, is related to the temperature changes. You can see temperatures have been rising in California. Temperatures, on average, have gone up about, essentially, you can see about 2 degrees, but in reality, it varies from different regions. And Southern California has been hit with higher temperature increases than parts of Northern California. Interestingly enough, when you get to the north and coastal counties, they also have been hit very heavily. So this is the kind of uncertainty that scientists are working on. How do you project which areas are going to be affected the most by different conditions? That's a really hard problem to do, okay? But what we have in the Bay Area is something called nuisance flooding, i.e. you get periodic flooding. It doesn't kill anybody. It destroys property, but in isolated areas, such as in Marin or in San Jose, but it's not widespread, okay? If we look to the future, though, this comes from one of many reports that have said, hey, look, if the flooding increases, this is what's at stake. Basically, $100 billion of current value and development is at stake. And in where Stanford is, in Palo Alto, we had a 50-year flood back in 1998. And it caused, at that time, $40 million worth of damage. And it was basically a succession of heavy rainstorms coming down. Now, if you get sea level rise and you repeat that storm, and that water came all the way across the 101 freeway, those of you know, came into the downtown area of Palo Alto, those homes are multi-million-dollar homes. So we're talking about damages that will far exceed. There'll be hundreds of millions of dollars of damages if we get a series of storms and we get sea level rise of any sort. We have coastal power plants that are up and down the coast that are potentially going to be flooded. We have wastewater treatment facilities, particularly in the Bay Area, that's the area that's in the box, that ring all the way around. Jody and I like to take a walk next to a wastewater facility. She smells them, I don't. I find the wastewater to be perfectly fine. But it's right next to a conservation area that people walk in. It's kind of weird, but that's what we do in the Bay Area. We walk near our wastewater. But the bottom line is, those treatment plants are right literally on the coast. And if there's a sufficient flooding, you're going to have to shut them down, which means that the waste that comes out of the houses cannot be dumped or treated and then dumped into the bay. Otherwise, you just discharge it untreated. And the bay is sufficiently shallow that that untreated waste will stay there for decades. Okay. By the way, there are ways that we could do something about that, because we have a person who works on wastewater right across the hall from me that has invented mobile units that could be put into the critical areas that could treat the waste further up and away from the water. But it would take a substantial investment on the part of local communities to actually have these things sitting around and ready to go. And you can imagine he has been unable to find any funding for that. Also, the airports. If you've landed, how many people have landed in San Francisco airport? Okay. As you know, when you come right down, it's right there on landfill out in the bay. And did you notice big flood walls, 9-foot flood walls? No. Okay, you didn't. Similarly with Oakland Airport, did you notice big flood walls? No, there's some rocks that are piled about 2.5 feet, but you don't see any flood walls there. Also, the traffic, the 101 is already flooding, and it could be substantially flooded even more. Now, are we doing nothing? No, we're not doing nothing. And yes, people have discussions, and we've been part of these discussions, but they're all isolated. And I'm going to come back to this point in my third lecture to talk about why isolated action can actually make things worse. But there are various groups that are meeting and convening. The only group that has put in flood walls is named after my wife's family, the Fosters. It's called Foster City. It's not actually named after them. But the bottom line is, it's on landfill, and they were unable to get any flood insurance from any private companies or from the federal government unless they put a levee in. So even though putting a levee in will have implications of diverting the water to other communities, they've had to go ahead and do it anyway. But most of these other projects, they're still on the drawing board. So I call this a cycle of benign neglect. What is the cycle of benign neglect? Well, we don't take the steps to prevent or protect because the costs are in the present and the benefits are in the future. And if you're a city manager or you're on the city council and you have homelessness, you have traffic problems, you have people bitching against you, bitching at the council meetings about the delivery of, our garbage trucks are not picking up regularly, those problems are way more pressing than something that might happen 5 or 10 years from now when you might not be in office, okay? So the public officials get rewarded for fixing problems. They look like heroes. Notice how they get photo op opportunities. They act like heroes. But they don't get rewarded properly by us as voters for taking preventive action, okay? And whether you like it or not, or whether it seems that way or not, when it comes to their careers, political actors are very rational, okay? But they're rational within a time framework that is not ultimately rational for the community as a whole. And then add to that the cities and the counties and all that have separate jurisdiction, and you have to coordinate all these people to get anything done, and that just makes it much harder because what we call transaction costs are very high. Now, one strategy that people have taken is what I call the co-benefits alternative strategy. And so the foundations came into New York and came into San Francisco with oodles of money and said, here, we're going to let the people solve this problem. And so they called it resilience by design, and they created these competitions where people would compete to have solutions for sea level rise. What happened was they took a lot of input from the community. And in order to get the community to pay for something that might help them in the future, you had to give them a benefit in the present. And the benefit of the present was better recreational facilities, better conservation facilities, better roads, etc. And what happens in those situations is that you get mission drift, because what is intended to sort of be a co-benefit becomes the most important benefit. So if you go on to the RBD website and you look at these proposals, they're all pitched in terms of the benefits of recreation, the benefits of conservation. They're not pitched in terms of the safety that they provide. Moreover, none of these things protect the infrastructure, and some of them have unproven technologies. We simply don't know what the level of protection they're providing. So this is an example of where, because the problem of sea level rise is at the base, is basically not present, we don't get that interaction between the problem and the policy space that the policy stream says. Okay, so what happens if we have more extreme weather? And I'm going to argue that I think the wildfires are really an interesting case, because I think wildfires and hurricanes and floods open up the window in a way that sea level rise doesn't. But I'm going to argue it does it for a very short period of time. And if you're not careful, if you've been watching what's happening in Houston, the time that you have people's attention is very short. And as a result, we're seeing that a lot of the steps that people want to take never get implemented, even though you allocate all the money. And allocating the money is not, in the end, successful in terms of getting people to take preventive steps. So if you take the Paradise Fire, which was the very sad fire for the retirement community that was in Northern California, you can see that it basically had 153,000 acres that were burned. You had 18,000 properties that were destroyed. You had 85 civilians that died. You had various people injured. Extremely expensive. And by the way, here in Oklahoma, as recently as 2018, you had wildfires that caused the evacuation of 120,000 people. So if in our poll we don't find wildfires as important to people in Oklahoma as it is in California, Oregon, and Washington, which makes sense because not as much exposure of the population to the wildfires, but it is nonetheless an issue for Oklahoma. And as we speak, by the way, there are mandatory evacuations in Los Angeles and the Pacific Palisades. And what I want to call attention to, because I'm going to spend a lot of time on this, is notice where the Saddle Ridge fire is. You can see where the urban areas are. The urban areas are right here, and you can see that the fires are right near those urban areas. And that's a really important aspect of what I'm talking about, and why people were quizzing me at the end of the first lecture. Is the problem a people problem, or is it a climate problem? Are we letting people, because of the moral hazard problem, are we letting people move into riskier and riskier areas and then having to pay for it after the fact? Well, I think it's both, because climate change is going to make all these areas even riskier, but there's no question that a lot of it has to do with our land use policy and our control over population, okay? By the way, after the fire's over, it's not over. In Santa Barbara, you may remember they had mudslides that affected a number of very famous people who had homes in Santa Barbara, and the mud came coming down, roaring down. If you talk to people, that was as scary as an event as the actual fire was, okay? So wildfire damages have soared in California. We're now looking at damages that PG&E is liable for of $30 billion. That $30 billion is money that could have been spent on mitigation, on creating charging stations for electric cars, for new kinds of technology to make buildings more efficient. There were a lot of things that we were planning to spend that money on, but now it has to be spent on resilience, okay? And likely these fires are going to get worse, because as the temperature goes up, all the various aspects, the distinctive aspects of the aridity and semi-aridity of the western areas are going to worsen the wildfire dangers and damages. So we got two things. We got continuing people moving into these areas, and then we have changing conditions that make them more dangerous. And so the term that's often used by people are the WUI areas, which is the wildland urban interface areas. These are areas which have been identified as particularly problematic. And the states that have grown a lot, particularly had middle-class people or wealthy people that want to live next to nature, that want to have the Western dream, that's all part of the romanticism of the West. They're the people that are more likely to move into these areas and expose themselves to it. They're also the people more likely to be able to buy both the private insurance and to afford the fire insurance and the flood insurance that it's offered by the government, right? And in California, it's of course up in these areas that are up near the parks and in the beautiful scenic areas in the north, right? So if we go back to it, will the prevalence of these fires affect public opinion enough to open up a policy window so that we can start to do things, either accommodation strategies or retreat strategies, okay? So let's talk about risk for a second, the way scientists talk about risk. So they talk about risk in terms of three features. One is the hazard. That's the degree of harm and damage that an event does. And obviously on one hand, nuisance flooding doesn't have a lot of damage. It doesn't destroy the whole home. Sometimes it does, but usually not. It maybe flood the floor, et cetera. You're not likely to lose your life with nuisance flooding, right? But on the other hand, wildfires are extremely dangerous. There are people in California, and indeed there are Stanford retired professors that live up in the hill in a retirement home. They had CAL FIRE come in and give a presentation. CAL FIRE said, if a fire comes down this hill, we will only be able to save a very small fraction of the people here. You will be incinerated. Okay? Now, when you're 80, 90 years old, you take that a lot calmer than when you're younger. And I was shocked because the guy that told me this was 82 years old. I said, did that freak you out? He said, no, you got to go anyway. So, okay. I don't think that's the common attitude, or at least that's probably not the attitude he would have at the moment that the flames are licking at his feet. But nonetheless, it's something to worry about, because evacuating people in these rural areas where there's only a single road is a problem. Now, we could do something about that, just the way you guys do with respect to tornadoes. We could start to think about, well, what kind of shelter can you provide so you don't have to move them, right? And what kind of oxygen when you have to provide to survive that kind of event. Anyway, hazard is one. Exposure, which is the number of individuals and properties that are actually at risk. And then the vulnerability, which is what is the resilience of that community in terms of financial resources to rebuild itself or to make it and protect itself after the fact. And so those are the three critical areas that we have to have policies on. And obviously high capacity cities that have a lot of income, like Palo Alto, if you wipe out all those $4 and $5 million homes, there's a whole bunch of people that will come in and rebuild in that area, which is both a blessing and a problem, right? And in terms of exposure, obviously if there's a fire in the middle of a rural area by itself, that's not necessarily the problem. But here's what the problem is, it's the smoke. So here what we did in the poll, this is California only, we divided into 4 different categories. So the one on the right is the personal experience with wildfires, which includes not only yourself, but anybody you know. And in Northern California, after the Sonoma fires and the Paradise fires, it's hard not to run into somebody who had a relative or who had their own property destroyed. So I'm not surprised that that number is 25%. And then if you ask, what's the exposure to smoke, you get to 50%. Now you say, well, okay, you know, and actually here, if you compare it to the West, the smoke in Northern California was an event which was unusual and traumatic to many of the residents in Northern California. It was not something that I had lived in Northern California for a couple decades. I'd never seen it. Most of the people that I know had never seen it before. And of course, these fires move around, and California was getting the worst of it, but you can see it hung around for at least 3 or 4 days. It was very thick. It was hard to operate in. And this is kind of a picture of downtown San Francisco during the smog. Now, the interesting thing is that we had noticed this at the Bill Lane Center because we'd been looking at air quality, bad air quality in the Central Valley, which, because of population explosion, was having a lot of the normal kinds of pollution that comes from cars and vehicles and population growth, and being a community trapped up against the mountains. But the one thing we noticed is that, and the top line is, the number of days where you were not meeting the federal air quality standards was actually going down, even in the San Fernando Valley, but the concentration of the bad days was extremely high in certain seasons, and you could see the peaks in the fall season. So what's happening is our fire seasons are getting longer. They're starting in basically June or July, and they're extending through to November, and the smoke is becoming more of a problem. Now you might say, okay, so the smoke comes. As I said, 52% of the people experience the smoke. Half of these people took precautionary measures. That does not include Bruce Cain and Jodie Foster. We did not. And we took a walk on the bay. And more often than not, this only meant staying indoors. But, you know, staying indoors doesn't matter if you don't have an air purifier. In fact, we're currently working with the Sean Parker Center and trying to set up a study to find out what happens if you stay indoors and you don't have an air purifier. It's entirely possible it's as bad as worse as going outside. So we don't know that. The studies haven't been done. Nobody knows, but we're trying to work with them to set up a study in Fresno that will do that. A lot of people simply said they paid attention to the air quality reports or stayed indoors. That would probably be us. But very few wore the highly graded respirators that were supposed to be good for you. The dust or the paper or cloth masks, those really don't do anything. The air purifiers might, but we don't know. So very few also consulted a healthcare provider. So what happens with the smoke is that people that have respiratory problems often exacerbates those problems, so they go to the hospital. But okay, that's just a temporary thing. But what's disturbing is the evidence that wildfire smoke may have potential consequences for your immune system and alter your immune system. And so the Sean Parker Center did this study where they compared controlled burns with a wildfire burn. Now, a control burn is when you go out in a managed way and you manage the forest by burning away some of the underbrush. And the level of heat and the level of particulate matter that's thrown up is much lower. People who live in the area don't like prescribed burns. Moreover, you have to get waivers from the clean air, the CARB, the local clean air boards to do this. There are very small windows where the weather conditions are correct. So doing prescribed burns is very hard, it's very expensive. So a lot of private owners and the state, which has been short of money, tend not to do it. The federal government, you'll see in a second, does. When you compare the effects on your immune system of the prescribed burns versus the wildfire burns, you can see that in terms of NOx, SOx, in terms of CO, in terms of PM 2.5, PM 10, all the different types of things that you can inhale, you can see on the right, the wildfires, you're inhaling a lot more because they're burning much more intensely. Okay? And by the way, that smoke does not stay in California. If the winds are blowing, it's going to go to Utah, potentially. I don't know whether it goes to Oklahoma. I won't claim that. But I think other fires that come from neighboring states, like Colorado, et cetera, or other areas around here, New Mexico, that's possible that that smoke does. And then the fact that it affects these Th1 cells, which, again, I'm not an expert on all this, but the point is it causes an alteration in the immune systems. And the people that are most vulnerable are children and older adults, okay? So at the very least, we should be taking measures that relate to that, but we really need to do prescriptive burns, but people don't like to do prescriptive burns, right? So the interesting thing politically from this is that so many of the environmental problems typically affect the lower income people and the minority people, but then the thing that is politically interesting about this is that the people that are most affected are higher educated in rural and suburban areas and tend to be white. Why? Because the amenity west attraction of going out and living in these areas that are very close to the fires is exposing them. Now, the reason that's politically interesting is that if you're a politically less powerful group, you're less likely to make things happen. What we're having is a real-time test. What happens when you actually get the middle class and the upper middle class and people that have money? You expose them to smoke. To what degree does that actually affect the politics? And that's something we'll be looking at. So you can see that the whites are the number one category. I'm not sure who the other are, but you can see that urban blacks and Latinos were less exposed because the urban areas are not as close to these fires. Plus, a lot of the urban areas are close to the sea breezes, which keep those fires at bay, right? So we really have to think about prescribed burns. But again, the problem is not a national problem, it's a local problem. It's neighborhoods not wanting to have prescribed burns because they'll be exposed to the smoke, even though collectively we'll all be better off if they do that. Now, there are alternatives to that. There are mechanical thinning. It's not exactly what Mr. Trump thinks. It's not people out there with rakes, but there are machines that you can use to thin in given areas. But of course, the very remote areas and the extensiveness of the forests in many of these states really doesn't make that very practical. It's much easier to burn the underbrush below the trees. So, as I said, the interesting irony, given what I said last lecture, which is the ambivalence that people have about the federal government, even though the federal government helped to establish and make the West hospitable, the irony is that they are the ones that are the best in terms of doing prescribed burns, and it's the private owners in the states that don't, okay? So, is the window of opportunity going to be long enough? Well, take a look at what happened with Hurricane Harvey. If you look at what is being reported, a lot of the money that was allocated has yet to be spent. 2 years have gone by. Shortly after that, a majority of people thought flooding was a major problem. Now it's down to 7%. A lot of people are rebuilding in these areas and buying these homes in these areas that have already flooded. And the question is, should we be supporting that? It's one thing if somebody wants to do that on their own, but to what degree do we provide any kind of assistance or encouragement of that? Or if you take a stronger view, to what degree should you actually be forcing people to do something different through zoning or, if you like, insurance policy? So this really says, okay, the problem stream potentially is much greater. We're now going to have a window of opportunity to do something. What the heck can we do? And I'm going to argue you can't do everything even if the window opens up. And the reason is that if you take the three strategies I talked about, accommodation, so you stay where you are, but you just fortify it and you try to hold off the natural disaster. The other one is removal and retreat. You try to encourage people to retreat and get away from these areas. And then the third one is you let the people decide, which is currently what we have. Not completely, but for the most part. And so this is a little hard to see, but I'll just point it out. If you ask whether or not property owners should do prescribed burns, you see that the California public says, yes, if you're a property owner, you should do prescribed burns. So that suggests a policy option the legislature could take. It won't make the locals happy, but you could probably pass that in the state. Allow residential development in, or to restrict future development. It's interesting, Californians are okay with the idea that you restrict future development, but you'll see in a moment they don't want to reverse current development. But they will go for future. So you could do some preventive zoning or some state requirements on that. Won't, again, be super popular. And the same thing for commercial developments. But now, when you get to mandating people to have insurance, no. Because that costs people money. If it comes to basically, having a mandated retreat and saying through zoning that if you've been flooded out, you can't rebuild in that area, no, they're not in favor of that, right? So rebuilding in the same location or forbidding or forcing people to retreat, you're not going to be able to do that. And when you look at that by party, you realize that these measures don't get even support from Democrats, or just barely below support by Democrats. The one thing that is a real partisan difference is that Democrats are more likely to want to use zoning laws to prescribe and mandate that people don't build in those areas. But if you're mandating insurance or fees, et cetera, they're not in favor. If you put in subsidies, and I'll just summarize this, if you say, should the government subsidize any of these activities, then you'll find that it doesn't get majority support of Democrats and Republicans. In other words, the willingness to pay, and what I said yesterday, to walk the walk and not just talk the talk, is not there yet. And the question is, how many fires does it take? How many floods does it take? How big does the bill have to get with extreme weather before people begin to say, we got to put some restrictions on where the people go? Yes, we also have to do some things that I believe mitigate the problem of climate change. But even if we do that, there are still natural causes of climate change, and there are the residual effects of the methane and the CO2 that we put up there. So we're going to have more extreme events like these fires in the future, no matter what we do. So again, to sort of summarize, what do we find? We find more support for accommodation than retreat, a preference for letting individuals to have the right to live where they want and to take on this risk. But the risk is always socialized, because if you think of the firefighters that have to go in and put that fire out, we had a Rural West conference where we interviewed the people that did this firefighting. Most of their effort is to protect property. So you could have acres and acres of land and only 3 or 4 homes, and basically the firefighters are there defending those 3 or 4 homes at extreme expense and risk to their life, okay? So even if it seems like an individual risk, it's not. Somebody has to pay the bill for fighting those fires. Somebody has to put their life on their line to protect that property. The willingness to pay for adaptation is shaky at best. There are some areas where we can go immediately. There are other areas that may take more experience before we can start to either assess people fees and taxes for these things, or to mandate insurance, or to check the zoning. So to sort of finish up, I would just say this. As I think about the problem, we really have to prioritize what we're doing in adaptation. And in a lot of areas, particularly urban areas, we really need to pay attention to the infrastructure first before we do other things. Because in the moment of crisis, as we have seen, if we can't fly planes in and out, if we can't get around on the roads, if our electricity grids are cut out and we can't communicate, if we can't evacuate people, if we don't have places to put people for months at a time, if we don't have emergency plans, if we don't do any of that, then you're going to see Katrina, you're going to see Harvey, you're going to see it repeated over and over again in different settings and different events. So we really have to prioritize what we're doing to get through the crisis. And then, and this I'll talk about a little bit more next time, we have to do some tough stuff in the stage after the disaster. So one of the real problems is that there are things that we could require in terms of accommodation strategies or retreat, but we have so much sympathy for the people that are victims, that have lost their homes, that want to rebuild. Our emotions get in the way of our commitment to keep them out of there. And when we do experiments when we show people pictures of this, you get the reaction of sympathy, which is a natural human and much admired reaction to have. But when we let the opportunity slip and we don't say to people, look, you can't, there have been 3 or 4 fires in this area, you've been flooded in this area numerous times, it doesn't make sense. It's not fair to the rest of us to socialize those costs. That is the hard discussion that we have to have, and I think it has to be had before the events where people make commitments, understand what the circumstances are. But whether our political system is capable of that, given the political inertia in the system, that's of course the big question. And so watching how California treats the wildfires is, I think, an extremely illustrative case study. Thank you. So I believe we have time for questions. Yes, we do. I only take easy questions, so please, nobody ask any hard questions. Thank you. Yeah.
How are you doing? I'm a native Californian, actually, from Southern California, Redondo Beach, and I think a big part of an issue with the wildfires is the lack of education with a lot of groups within the state. Because, like, I was lucky enough to go to school where I was taught about these things and how to prevent these things. My sister actually lost her home in the Sonoma fire, and my friends at UCSB are dealing with problems at Santa Barbara. So how much do you think of education as an issue with how these fires are dealt with and the general idea in our state? Because people who don't live near the beach or where these fires occur sometimes are ignorant or lack the knowledge at all of how these things happen.
Yeah. So the answer is that's definitely part of the problem. You know, there's pretty good coverage of these things. So if you're reading the news or even if you're getting it off Facebook, you're going to see videos of this, you're going to see pictures of this. So when we ask whether you're aware that the problems are happening in the state, you typically get pretty high numbers. People are aware of these events, although fires in Southern California don't get as much coverage in Northern California and vice versa. I do think the fire issue has not been discussed nearly as much as the flooding and the sea level rise, so I think there's a high level of ignorance about that. Less so in Southern California than in Northern California. But to be honest, I just don't think education by itself ever does it. This was a theme that I had in the first lecture, which is you got to take an all of the above strategy, and there will be communities that will resonate and well with the education and resonate well with the moral questions that are raised about socializing risk on other people. There are some people that will be susceptible to that appeal. You take it to Berkeley, California, and you got a chance, okay? But you take it to other parts of California for a variety of reasons, you don't. And especially, and not just on a partisan divide, the reality is that taking steps to protect yourself from these events costs money. And if the state doesn't have programs to subsidize that, a lot of people in California, you know, are basically paying all they can just to stay in the damn house because it's so expensive, right? So there's no extra cash in there to take on preventive measures. So it's a real problem given the you know, the situation of housing that we have in California, and the land is fairly scarce, and people continue to be looking for housing, and we expect the housing crisis to get worse. And so the temptation to say, well, damn it, how often can lightning strike twice? It's the gamblers, isn't it called the gambler's fallacy, that if you've lost, you can't lose again, or something like that? Well, that's what it is. Okay, hey, wait a minute, there was a fire in Paradise. That can't happen again. Yeah, okay, it can, and so can flooding. And so, you know, education is part of it, but I think we need hard incentives because otherwise it's just not going to be a stable equilibrium. We have in the back, yeah.
Thank you for taking your time and coming here. Some people say extreme and mechanic animal agriculture is causing disastrous damage to the environment. Would you what do you think about that?
I lost the first part of that. What's causing the extreme damage?
Extreme and mechanic animal agriculture, like mass production and mass slaughtering.
Oh, of meat and things? Is that what you're talking about?
Livestock, yes.
Yeah, okay. Well, there's no question that cows emit methane, and that they, and that the meat industry is part of it. I don't think that gets into the mitigation. What are the most important things we need to do in mitigation? If you look at carbon emissions by different sectors, the agricultural sector definitely contributes, but that's not the major contributor. The major contributor right now, and the hardest piece for California, for example, will be transportation. It's the cars and the gasoline, et cetera. And that's why the governor has chosen to make transportation a big initiative, and to try to get people into electric cars, to put the infrastructure of charging stations around the state. We're doing very well with respect to the electricity grid, but it's going to be hard to finish that. A lot of the success we had with the electricity grid had to do with home efficiency and rooftop solar. But the question is, where are we going to get the extra electrons that come from green sources? It won't be able to, we can't do it completely from rooftop solar. So while I think the agriculture is a piece of that, I think if you're prioritizing where the most important pieces are, you're going to look at the electricity grid, finishing the job of making that 100% renewable. That will possibly be facilitated by the development of batteries, better batteries. So there's a lot of research being done at OU and Stanford and other places to figure out how to have these systems that use renewables like solar combined with batteries. And then the transportation piece, which is going to be a real difficult, because a lot of Western states are very car-oriented, largely because of what I was talking about. We don't have the mass transit systems that you have in the East. We have these high concentration of urban areas and large separation of rural areas, which means that people want to have a car. I mean, people in LA will drive 150, 200 miles to go have dinner, right? So those kinds of habits are going to have to change in the future, right? I've got some questions up here in the front. This is, well, I think you want the mic or not? Yeah, you got to hold on for the mic, Barbara. No, I know you can, but we want to preserve your words for posterity.
Okay, fine. You may not want to, but I'm getting that you're here and you're very happy that students are here.
Yes.
And you have students in Southern California at Stanford, or Middle California. And that's who's going to be affected by all of this. Mm-hmm. What kind of reaction are you getting from your students? Are they expecting that this will be, like I'm sitting here thinking somebody's going to solve this. How are your students thinking about this, and how are they responding to the fact that it's going to take money, and maybe their money?
Yeah. Well, I told the story yesterday, so I'll have to do an abbreviated version of it. But the bottom line is that if you're asking, do students say that climate change is a massive challenge? The answer is yes. If you ask students whether they were willing to pay a carbon tax or to make themselves into a model campus where they make sacrifices, they say, no, this is for business to do. And we say, no, this is for all of us to do. Climate change mitigation is going to hurt everybody. We're going to have to change our lifestyles in substantial ways. Go back to what I said. This is a much more difficult problem. And so yesterday I said the irony is that that people talk the talk in a lot of green areas but don't walk the walk. Now, a couple people in the audience said, Bruce, you're being very hard on Democrats. Yeah, because that's where you can make the most progress right now. It's going to be very hard to take climate change deniers, the few that are left there for whatever reason, going to be hard to change. So what we need to make progress with are the people that at least accept in principle that there's a challenge here. And the young people are a good example of that. And I think the campuses should be transforming themselves into experiments for how to have completely renewable, completely clean environments. And should take on that challenge to test some of the things that we want to have the rest of society. So lead by example is what I say. Stanford is going to do this, and I think OU could do this, and it could make a huge difference. And we may discover some things are doable and some things are not doable, but in the end, it's not enough to like something on Facebook. It's not enough to even show up and demonstrate in front of somebody's office, but then, take an airplane to take a vacation in Thailand, okay? You got to walk the walk. You can't just talk the talk.
Not to downplay the catastrophic nature of wildfires and flooding, but do you find local governing entities more willing to restrict development through zoning restrictions on areas that experience mudslides?
Yeah.
I mean, when the ground just literally gives way underneath your home,
Yeah.
are local government entities willing to restrict development in those places? Because we keep seeing it happen all the time.
Yeah. No, agreed. I had to pick, there are only so many catastrophes I can deal with in an hour. So I had to pick and choose my catastrophes. But mudslides are absolutely right up there with wildfires and floods in terms of, if you take my three categories of exposure and hazard in particular, they're not as bad on that third category, because often these are people that are more wealthy, and so their vulnerability in terms of their ability to rebuild, unfortunately, is not low. They can rebuild. And so I would predict that given enough time, if we don't take zoning restrictions, people will figure out a way to stabilize the soil. Now, I happen to know, having lived in Southern California, that homeowners do pay attention to the instability of the ground. So I have hope that the market, to some extent, will affect this, that insurance companies and the inability to get homeowners insurance. Flood insurance is a supplemental thing, but home insurance, as a result of building on an unstable ground, is very hard to get. So if people want to rebuild and not take insurance and are willing to pay for the consequences, you know, I guess it's going to be hard to oppose that, even though, as I said, it socializes costs on the rest of us, because the fire department has to come rescue them and has to do the cleanup and all that other stuff. So I don't know what has happened in Santa Barbara. It's an interesting question. I haven't really focused on mudslides yet. As I said, that's a very good question. I'm just curious right now on the wildfire situation, what's happening in terms of the steps that are being taken by local communities. I'm interested in what Tulsa is doing right now. Tulsa, after having, 8 flooding incidents since the 20s, is starting, when, in 40 or 50 years ago, people were living up above the floodplain, and then they were increasing building on the floodplain. That's just exactly what we're having in California. This is obviously human nature we're dealing with. And, you can either just keep rebuilding and repaying for this, or you can say, no, enough is enough. And I don't know whether, it doesn't matter whether it's floods or mudslides, we have to take these steps. But I can tell you that in California, we've had a hard time. California's a state that loves regulation. We are famously regulating the hell out of the state, but we can't find the courage when people are down and out to say you can't rebuild the same way. And I understand that, because I feel the same sympathy. And I suspect with the mudslides, that same thing may be going on, but I don't know for certain.
Thank you for your speech. I'm very curious. Lots of financial companies are in San Francisco, and lots of high technology companies, they are in Silicon Valley. So what they are thinking about climate change?
Yeah, do you know where the Google campus is? Yes, and that's very close to the water. It's in basically a flooded area. Facebook similarly is out on the sort of, if you like, the flatland, the floodplain of Menlo Park. So for whatever reason, high tech has decided to put itself right out on the frontier. Now, to some extent, if you look at their structures, they are elevated, and they probably have thought about prevention strategies. But there exists a scenario, nobody knows what the probability is, of sea level rise, which is much more rapid than what I showed you, the 2050, 2030 scenarios. Basically, and that is, we do not know what happens, or I shouldn't say we don't know, it's not me, scientists don't know what will happen if the ice, which is currently on the lands of Antarctica or in the Arctic, actually melt and slip off faster than we think. And that's why you see articles about what's going on underneath the ice and the concern they have. So far, the ice that has broken off, it is my understanding most of that was already sitting in the ocean, but it was just extended off the land. What the scientist community really worries about is if it comes off the land, and then you could get much more rapid sea level rise. And one of the problems with adaptation is you simply don't know what is a safe level of protection. So, maybe it's 6 feet, maybe it's 9 feet. Well, if you go to 9 feet in the Bay Area, or you go in San Francisco, or any place around coastal areas, the higher you put your wall, the more expensive it is, and the more it obstructs the scenic view that people love when they live on the coast. So guess who complains about it? The people that might potentially benefit from it. And so the politics is such that we just, a proposal to put one down in the area not far from Palo Alto. I've talked to the person that's negotiating that for basically the local authority that's working on this. And he says, well, if we're going to be totally safe, we would like to make it 9 feet because we don't know about the scenario with respect to the icebergs. All we know is if it sort of goes as it currently is, that it'll probably be okay with 6 feet. And the neighbors have grabbed that. That's not what they want. They don't want to have 9 feet of obstruction. They want 6 feet so they can still see the beauty of the bay. And so they've compromised, and they're making the fence at something that the people are willing to accept. So, it's very tough. Facebook, Google, all these companies have put themselves in an exposed area. I will say, okay, this is heresy, but I will say that some number of residents in the South Bay will cheer if Google moves to Oklahoma, okay? And Facebook in particular, because Facebook is perceived as having lost the election in 2016. So I will just tell you that people in San Francisco that can't find housing, and people in the Southern Bay that are choked by the traffic of the commute. Now, Google, to be fair, is more responsible and has built housing in basically in Mountain View, so that they're actually trying to minimize the traffic. But the level of irritation with the workers has spilled over into gentrification fights and battles over the Google buses throughout the Bay Area. So this is a major issue. So it's not obvious to me that it's a bad thing if some of these companies relocate to other parts of the country and not all stay in the Bay Area. Up over there. Question a day. You asked me a question yesterday.
Yeah, I am a civil engineer by training.
Oh, okay.
And I have practiced in California, so I know the earthquake regulations prevent you from building about 150 feet from the fault line. So that applies, and there is a permitting process or cities control. So there is a model for California to borrow from. Yeah. And you're right, you cannot say somebody not to build, but eventually you can move people out, slowly, like what you did for earthquakes.
Yeah, and it took a series of earthquakes to get there. Good point. I will say, interesting thing about earthquakes is you don't know what area of the Bay Area is. So everybody has an incentive to get earthquake insurance, but less than 15% of Californians have earthquake insurance. So a lot of people are vulnerable, even, and they are, of course, exposed. And the hazards can be very great. I had the dubious distinction of being in back-to-back earthquakes. One when I was living in LA that happened, Whittier Narrows earthquake, and then I moved up, and in 1989, the next year, I managed to get there for the Bay Area quake. And so I had 2 properties that were damaged and I had to be fixed. So yes, I know what you're talking about. And unfortunately, of course, that's something we can't at the moment. We're waiting for you guys to come up with a solution, but California claims it has a better detection system, but I don't know how much time that buys you. I think it gives you the time to maybe get off the toilet and get in a safe place. But beyond that, I don't know what it does for you. You'll tell me, I guess.
I guess you were talking about heightened weather extreme scenarios in lots of different states. So for states that are less homogeneous and have more politically dubious consequences, how would you, if there's so many problems in enforcing restrictions and regulations in California itself, how are other states supposed to attempt to make, inroads into? Yeah,
so I don't think there's that much difference. What I'm trying to argue is, we're really all in the same boat. Yes, it is worse in a state that really doesn't accept the reality of that on the official record. But again, if you go to Joe's data, it looks as though there are a lot more people that are ambivalent about that. So again, I come back to the following. On the adaptation front, I think local communities have to sort of take the initiative on this and show that it can be done. On the mitigation front, I argued yesterday that you should take a lesson out of the wind. As I said yesterday, you could win a lot of money on the West and East Coast at dinner parties by betting people what state is the leading implementer of wind and what's number 2. And most of the people at the dinner party will not get Texas and Oklahoma, okay? So you have to understand, well, why did it happen? It happened because you have wonderful wind resources that would be wasted if you didn't build that. And you also had, even though Texas won't admit it, you had both federal tax credits and you had the building of the transmission lines for various purposes that actually facilitated, even though they don't provide any direct support or consumer support for the wind, it still took off. And now, Oklahoma did provide subsidies, tax credits, and other things. I know that there's a battle, and yesterday everybody reminded me of Mr. Ham. I got it. I read the newspapers. I understand that. And the battle is never over until it's over. And there will always be conflicts between different sectors. But the bottom line is that I think in the future, and I said this yesterday, that there's enormous opportunity for solar, rooftop solar. Once you have the right policies where consumers can save money, you're going to see a lot of people adopt rooftop solar, and that will give you, you're already at about 30% in terms of wind as a function of your energy portfolio, which is pretty damn good for a state that doesn't believe in climate change, right? As I said, Texas and Oklahoma walk the walk, but they don't talk the talk. They're too embarrassed to talk the talk. Okay? Oh, God, you mean we really are doing good things for the environment? Oh, my God, that's bad. But you walk the walk because it makes sense. And so the more technology can drive down the cost, the more that we can provide incentives to homeowners to adopt these things, the more they're going to do it regardless of where they stand on these symbolic issues.